Okay, so we're diving into a pretty chilling story today. You sent us this episode of Anatomy of Murder, and it's about this guy, Anthony Wilson, and the idea that a 911 call could have, like, prevented his murder, but
Yeah.
it just went ignored.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And it's really interesting because we're going to be using this podcast episode as our main source, to kind of dissect the investigation. And we're going to see how even like the smallest details, right, they can become so important in these cases.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's start by setting the scene. Anthony's apartment was in Brooklyn, kind of a basic place, just one room, mattress on the floor.
And when they found his body, it was already decomposing on that mattress. So it seemed like he had been there for a while. And the decomposition made it, a little difficult to figure out exactly what happened, how he died right away. But there was a lot of blood, especially in the bathroom. And it looked like someone had tried to clean it up. So that's always a red flag, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So during the investigation, detectives found a 911 call, and it was made from Anthony's phone a couple of months before they found his body.
And this is important because, when you think about 911 calls, they're supposed to get a response right away. Like they're there for emergencies.
Exactly, yeah. Okay, so this is the call. You can just hear the fear in his voice. He's talking about, like, this woman in his place. She's acting crazy, and he wants her out. And then silence.
It's chilling. And get this, they never sent anyone to his apartment, like no patrol car. It's so rare for that to happen with 911 calls, even if it's just a hang-up.
It's a huge mistake,
Mm.
especially with what they learned later from the autopsy. Anthony didn't die naturally. He was stabbed, like, multiple times.
10 times? That's not random. That's personal, right? Like someone was really angry.
Yeah, definitely. And with stabbings, they're up close.
Right.
So investigators were hoping to find some DNA.
Right, because there's a good chance the attacker could have been cut themselves during the struggle and left some DNA behind. So while they waited for the DNA results, they started asking around the building, talking to neighbors, and they found out that Anthony, he'd had some problems with drugs and sometimes let women stay at his place.
It's sad. But that kind of lifestyle, it can be dangerous. Two witnesses even mentioned this woman named Renee. She'd been staying with him. And one witness even said that Renee, she admitted to stabbing him.
Whoa, okay. So they had a possible name. Did they look into her?
Oh, yeah, they did. They ran her name through the system and found someone with a record in the area. And they even put her photo in a lineup. And that witness who said she talked to Renee, she picked her out right away. So they tracked her down. She was living in New Jersey, working in Manhattan.
Sounds like they were close to making an arrest.
Yeah, you would think so.
Mhm.
But when they questioned her, Renee had an alibi, a good one. She was working when Anthony was killed.
So the witness got it wrong. It just goes to show you, eyewitness testimony, it can be helpful, but man, it can be so unreliable.
Definitely. It's not like they show on TV. But then there was a break. They found out that Anthony's EBT card, the one for benefits, was being used after he died.
So they were thinking maybe we can find the killer by tracking the card.
Exactly. They wanted to check the security footage, from the places the card was used.
Mhm.
But back then, they didn't keep the footage for very long, so it was already gone. Another dead end.
Wow. Technology has really changed how they do these investigations.
It definitely has. But finally, after months of waiting, they got the DNA results back,
Mhm.
and there was a match. But it wasn't Renee.
Really? Hold on. Who was it?
A woman named Natara Wisdom. No one had ever heard of her before. The crazy thing is, she looked a lot like Renee, like they could be sisters almost.
No way. What are the odds? And that really makes you think about what we were saying about eyewitnesses, right? Like sometimes what you think you saw isn't the whole story.
Makes you think about all the things that can change your memory, how you see things.
Totally. So they had this new suspect, Atara Wisdom. What was she like?
Well, unlike Renee, Atara, her life kind of fit the profile of someone who might have been involved in Anthony's world.
Yeah.
She had a criminal history, kind of a transient lifestyle. They finally found her at a homeless shelter.
Trying to find someone at a shelter, that can be tough. There are laws, to protect the people there, so it can be harder to find someone and talk to them.
Yeah, it's a balancing act. You got to protect people,
Yeah.
but you also got to do a thorough investigation. But eventually they got Atara to come down to the station for an interview.
So they had her in the interview room. Did they tell her right away about the DNA? That they had her at the scene?
They didn't. They held back on that. They wanted to see what she would say without knowing they had that evidence against her.
Smart move. Let her talk, then hit her with the hard proof later.
Yeah, exactly. And Atara did talk. She admitted to staying with Anthony, said she was there to use drugs. She said they weren't, like, together, but that Anthony, he was different when he was high.
So she's placing herself there, but trying to downplay her connection to him.
Right. And then she says that Anthony made a move on her, that she woke up and he was touching her.
Sounds like she's setting up a self-defense claim.
Yeah, that's what it seemed like. She told him, she confronted him about it, and they had this big argument. She left but came back a couple of times to get her stuff.
So she's at the scene multiple times before the stabbing even happens. What happened next?
Okay, so she describes this other argument like a really bad one. This time it got violent. She said Anthony blocked the door, hit her, and pulled a sweater over her head.
Trying to make him look like the bad guy.
Exactly. She said she was scared for her life, and that's when she pulled a knife and stabbed him. She didn't say how many times, just that she, kept stabbing him.
That's vague, especially since there were so many wounds. Were the detectives starting to think her story didn't add up?
They were. A lot of red flags were popping up. 10 stab wounds. It's hard to say that was just self-defense, And that witness who said Renee confessed, she never mentioned seeing any injuries on Renee. You'd think after a fight like that, there would be some.
That's true. And if she was really scared for her life, wouldn't she tell someone? Or go to the hospital, and she took Anthony's stuff and left him there.
Yeah, it doesn't really sound like self-defense when you think about it. But the biggest problem with her story was that 911 call.
Ah, right, the call. How did that fit in with her saying it was self-defense?
It didn't at all. Remember, in the call, Anthony's the one asking for help. He's saying Natara's the one acting crazy.
He's the one who's scared, begging for the police to come.
Exactly. And the way the call just ends, that makes Natara's story even harder to believe.
So with that 911 call, did the case go to trial?
Oh, yeah, it did, in Brooklyn. And, a lot of people don't really understand trials and what charges like second-degree murder really mean. Maybe you could explain that to our listeners.
Sure. So in a trial, the prosecution, they have to prove that the defendant is guilty, like beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, they said that the 911 call showed Anthony was the one in danger and that what Natara did, it wasn't justified.
Okay, and what about her defense? What did they say?
They tried to say it was self-defense. They painted Anthony as the aggressor, someone who had hurt Natara before. And they said she was just protecting herself. But the prosecution said, look at how many times she stabbed him. Look what she did afterward. That's not just self-defense.
So what does second-degree murder mean in all this?
Second-degree murder is a serious charge. It means the killing was intentional but not planned. So the prosecution had to prove Natara meant to kill Anthony, even if she didn't, plan it out beforehand.
So the jury had to decide, was it self-defense or was it something worse?
Exactly. They had to look at all the evidence, Natara's testimony, the 911 call, everything.
It's crazy how one 911 call can change everything. And the jury, they had to, weigh that evidence against what Natara said and the evidence from the scene.
It really is like solving a puzzle, huh? Every little piece matters.
Totally. So what did the jury decide?
Guilty. Second-degree murder.
Wow. That couldn't have been easy for them. The whole case was so complicated.
Yeah, it was. A lot to think about. But that 911 call, that was a big part of their decision. It showed that Anthony was the one who was really in danger, and that what Natara did wasn't self-defense.
It shows how important those calls are,
Yeah.
and how much they can matter in court. But this deep dive, it's not just about the evidence and the verdict. It's about the people, how it affected them.
That's a really good point. We focus on the victim and the killer, but the detectives, they put so much into these cases.
Right. It's easy to forget they're dealing with real people, real tragedy.
They see the worst of humanity every day. It has to affect them.
Yeah. In the Anatomy of Murder episode, Detective Scandal, he said this case really stuck with him. It's like Anthony was forgotten, He was struggling with addiction, and no one seemed to care.
And it seemed like that feeling that Anthony was forgotten, it made Detective Scandal work even harder to find the killer, so he wouldn't just be another statistic. It says a lot about these detectives, their dedication, their empathy.
Absolutely. They saw Anthony as a person, even with his struggles. But this case is bigger than just them, isn't it? It makes you think about the bigger problems that led to this whole thing.
You're right. We have to talk about addiction and homelessness, how they make people vulnerable. It's a sad truth.
It's heartbreaking. Anthony was struggling, and it doesn't sound like he had anyone to help him.
And sadly, his story isn't unique. We need better systems to help people with addiction, people who are homeless. We need to fix the root of these problems so this doesn't keep happening.
And it's not just about stopping violence, right? It's about seeing everyone as a human being, no matter what their situation is.
That's so important. This deep dive has shown us how much work goes into solving these cases and how important every little detail is.
It's amazing how all those little pieces come together.
Yeah.
But it also makes you think about, the trauma, how it spreads.
Right. We can't forget about the trauma that everyone goes through, the detectives, the witnesses, and of course, Anthony's family.
Yeah, even if they weren't close to him, his death must have affected them.
Absolutely. Trauma goes beyond the victim. And that brings us to something else. The witness who thought Renee was the killer.
That was wild. Makes you wonder how many other cases have been messed up because of a mistake like that.
It shows how even when people are trying to do the right thing, eyewitnesses can be wrong.
So what can we do about that? How can we make sure those testimonies are accurate?
That's a tough one. But there are things we can try, like making sure the officer doing the lineup doesn't know who the suspect is. That helps with bias. And teaching officers how to avoid influencing witnesses.
Those are good ideas. They could make a real difference.
Yeah, we need to keep looking for ways to make eyewitness testimony more reliable. But we also have to remember that it's not perfect.
This deep dive has been, really eye-opening. We've talked about how homicide investigations work, how important it is to speak up for people who are marginalized, and how we need to change the justice system.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that justice is complicated. And even if we never have all the answers, we have to keep learning and trying to make things fairer.
Before we move on, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, about how this case affected the detectives, emotionally.
It's so easy to forget about that side of it. They deal with so much darkness.
Do you think they get enough support? Do police departments do enough to help them with the mental and emotional stress of the job?
That's a big question. Some departments are doing better, but there's still a stigma around mental health in law enforcement. We need to make sure officers have the help they need to deal with the trauma they see.
Yeah, it's a tough job. It takes a lot of strength. We need to make sure that the people who protect us are also being protected themselves.
I agree. Their well-being is important, not just for them, but for the quality of their work, too.
This has been a great deep dive. We've really gotten to see the human side of this story, for the victim and for the people trying to find justice. So we've been talking about Anthony Wilson and, everything that led to his murder.
Yeah.
And how they caught the killer, Natara Wisdom.
It's been a heavy one, right? Addiction, violence, and how society kind of forgets about these people.
It makes you think about choices, and how they can lead to something really bad.
Yeah, for sure. The paths we take, how our lives turn out, it's all connected.
What made Anthony let these people he barely knew stay at his place, maybe for drugs? It's a dangerous way to live, and it often ends like this.
Yeah. Anthony's addiction, it definitely made him vulnerable. He was making risky choices, but we can't forget, addiction, it's a disease. It's not just about being a bad person.
That's true. It's easy to judge. But addiction can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter who you are or where you come from.
Exactly. We need to treat it like a health problem, with compassion, not just judgment.
And then there's Natara. Her story shows how personal struggles can turn violent, and the consequences are huge.
Both of their lives, Anthony's and Natara's, they were tough lives. We don't know everything about her, but it's clear she was dealing with her own stuff.
It's complicated. We can recognize that she might have a hard life, but that doesn't excuse what she did. She killed Anthony, and now she's in prison. It's just sad all around.
It shows how all these problems are connected. Poverty, addiction, violence, it's like a trap that's hard to get out of.
It makes you think about the system. What kind of help is there for people like them? Could we have prevented this?
Big questions. There's no easy answer. But we have to fight for better policies, better programs. We need to help people before they get to that point of violence.
Give them a chance to make things better.
Exactly. Everyone deserves a chance, no matter what.
One thing that really stuck with me from this deep dive is how important it is to listen to victims, to believe them, even when their lives are messy or their stories are hard to follow.
That's a good point. That 911 call, it was Anthony's cry for help, and no one heard him. We have to take every call seriously every time someone says they're being hurt. We have to protect them.
We can't ignore anyone's pain. It's easy to forget about people who are struggling, people on the edge of society.
Yeah.
But this case shows us that everyone matters. Everyone deserves justice.
And sometimes the truth is hidden in the details. A missed phone call, a story that doesn't quite add up, a tiny piece of evidence, and when you put it all together, you see the bigger picture.
So this has been a deep dive into the life and death of Anthony Wilson. I hope it made you think about what justice really means, about how trauma affects people, and about speaking up for those who are often ignored.
Remember, every life matters. Every story is important. And violence, it hurts everyone, not just the victim.
This is just the beginning. There's so much more to learn. Go check out the full episode of Anatomy of Murder. Keep asking questions. How can we make the world a safer, fairer place for everyone? That's what this is all about.